So the goal of today's lecture is to add a little bit of styling to our application, look at how we might add a little bit of JavaScript, but before those two things, look at how we would add images for these individual products. We'd like to sort of augment the idea of a product so that it can have an image associated with it. Now, typically, if we were doing this in a sort of a more structured Rails application, we would be using a gem for this. And there's a number of gems that allow us to do things like image attachments. Where we would go to look for sort of what would be the best gem to use, we would probably go to the Ruby toolbox, and from there we would look at sort of the file uploads, or the Rails file uploads category. So if I look for file uploads, see sort of the different file upload gems that exist, and sort of the top two that are ranked the highest are Paperclip and Carrier Wave. The rankings are sort of algorithmic rankings that come from things like how many people are actually using these gems based on rubygems.org, and also things like how active the development is on the gem if it's up on GitHub. So if you're thinking about adding images to your actual project, you probably want to be using one of those two gems, Paperclip or Carrier Wave. The way I'm going to do it today would be suitable. Like it would get you the points for images on the project requirements, but it's not necessarily the best way of going about it. It involves a bit of manual labor that the other solutions, the gem-based solutions, aren't going to include. But it gives me an opportunity to bring up lots of different topics. So I'm going to do it in this way, which isn't necessarily the best way, and then I'll talk about its limitations as I do so. So up to now, we've had a sort of the display of a product, and right now we're really just displaying the product's title and description. There's a couple other properties, so we'll get those out of the way. We'll actually add those to the product partial so we can get familiar with adding things for display, and then when we go to add an image, it will just be another version of displaying a bit more information. So the other information that we have as far as products go, if I do like from my console product.new, I can see that a product has a title and description, both of which we're displaying, but a price and a stock quantity are also present. So I might go and edit my partial, my app views product partial, so that it displays both of those things. I'll just display them inside of paragraph tags, and so I'll put two paragraph tags. Into one I will say price, the other I will say stock quantity. Not every store is going to want to actually display to the front-end user the stock quantity, but some stores might want to do that. And then what we could do is we can use our ERB echo statements to echo out the product.price. And then for this one, the product.stock quantity. Adding it in this partial will have it so that both on the index and the show page we get to see these things. Price, stock quantity, price, stock quantity. A few problems we can see right away. Look at this price. I probably entered the price as $8.45, but it's being stored as a decimal in the database and a floating point number within Rails. And the deal with floating point numbers is they're as precise as your language wants them to be. And in this case, Rails, or Ruby specifically, is telling us, well, this is close enough to 8.45, but with dollar amounts, that's not really what we want to see. We want to see this, to two decimal places. We'd like a dollar sign in front of it. Maybe we'd like the 0, in this case, the 67.0. We probably want that padded to 00. We can manually sort of make these modifications by way of like string manipulation or something, or whatnot. But Rails has some wonderful helpers that we could use. And so the helper that we can use for price, I'm just going to put these things on a few separate lines. So for price, the helper we can use is called number to currency. And just by adding that alone and passing it, it's a method, so passing it a single argument of the price that I want to display. I go back to my page, things look a lot nicer. 67.00, this is now 845, that's great. The stock quantity right now is not a big deal, but imagine if we were dealing with really large numbers in terms of stock. Like for goat cheese, if we had like 91 million units or some odd of goat cheese. We just got like a windfall in goat cheese. We have a lot of it. Displaying that number isn't so clear. And there's a nice little helper that Rails provides us for if we don't care about super sort of precise numbers. Like for this one, our users probably don't care that we have this exact quantity of goat cheese, but they might like to know that we have like 99 million units around. So we have this fun little helper called number to human. And what it does is it just makes it more readable. And now it says 99.1 million. For smaller numbers, it's just going to leave them alone. So for 34, it leaves it alone. For 342, it leaves it alone. I think it starts kicking in around the thousands. So there, 3.42 thousand. So it's just a nice little helper. There's a bunch of them. They also, you can modify them more than just passing in a single argument. There's a lot more that they can do. And if you go to the API ruby.rails.org, you can look at the different number two helpers. There's a bunch of different ones. And so the number to currency helper, you can see the different things. You can change the precision, you can change the unit that's being used, the delimiter that's being used, the comma. If you were selling to, say, a European market, they actually use a period instead of a comma for their thousand separators. So you would change the delimiter for that. There's a number to phone for formatting phone numbers, those kind of things. So there you go. There's adding display properties from our product into our partial. We'd also like to be able to display an image here. Something like having another paragraph tag in here and being able to drop in an image with a source and maybe an alt and have it display an image that's associated with our particular product. Got two problems here. One, where's this image located? And two, how do we properly path to it? And so we're going to handle those two things separately. Where it's coming from, well, we're going to be putting images into a specific folder in our Rails project. And this is the aspect of this style of image solution that isn't optimal. We're going to have to manually add images to the app assets images folder, like just manually dragging and dropping image files in there. And so for every product that we have on our store, we'd have to get an image of it, maybe take a picture of it, resize it in some sort of photo editing tool to the right size, and then put it into this folder. And then we need some way of associating that image file name with our product so that when we're displaying the actual products in our store, Rails knows which product image to load. And then we actually have to load it and properly path to the app assets images folder itself. So we'll start with the sort of association idea. How do we associate image file names with products? And we're going to do that by adding a new column to the products database table. And so we're going to go to the command prompt and we're going to run a generation statement. But let's just take a quick review of the last time we added something to our migrations. When we first created a model for our products, Rails generated this migration for us automatically. When we did a Rails generate model command, it built this migration that describes the fact that we want to create a new table called products, and a product is going to have these properties. we can, from the command prompt, generate new migration files that are sort of empty for us ourselves to modify. So I could say Rails generate migration, add images, enter. I'm not going to press enter because there's a nicer way to do this. But what this would do if I ran Rails generate migration, add images, I'd get a new file in that same folder. It would have a class called add images inside of it, and that would be coming from the name of the migration that I specified here, add images. And it would have an empty change method inside of it, and then the file name would be a timestamp of the current date and time, add images. And I'd be able to go in here and I would be able to type in a migration description of what I would like to change in my database. But the addition of new columns to a database table in Rails is such a common thing that there's a sort of a shortcut for doing this. And the shortcut is that we say Rails G migration or Rails generate migration. And then I'm going to type out the migration name in a very specific way. I'm always going to say add X to Z, where X is going to be the name of the column I want to add, and Z is going to be the name of the table that I want to add it to. So add underscore, let's say the column is going to be image file name. So add image file name to products. And Rails is going to parse this out and say, okay, you want to add a column called image file name to your table called products. And then I have to tell Rails what the data type is of image file name. So I re-specify image file name, and I say that it's going to be a string. And by pressing enter here in my DB folder, I'm going to get a new migration file, which will be a date timestamp followed by, it's going to be called add image file name to products. And inside of it, there will be a change statement, and we can go take a look at that right now. So here's my new migration, timestamp, add image file name to products. And if I look inside of it, it contains this single line. Sure, I could have just written that myself with my empty migration, but it's just why write it myself when Rails can write it for me based on this command. So now I need to run this migration, and we do that by doing a rake db migrate and pressing enter. And so the key thing with Rails databases is you never want to be manually altering these databases. You never want to be opening up your SQLite file, or if you're using a different database, you never want to be going in and typing raw SQL commands or using a GUI to add columns or create new tables or anything. You want to do everything by way of a migration. And so there's a whole Rails guide on how to do different things migration-wise. Some of them have these kind of shortcuts that you can use from the command prompt. Some of them are just you create a new empty migration file and you just add to it. Okay, having run that, I can see that the migration was successful because it tells me that it ran the add column statement and it tells me how long it took. Often, if an error occurs, instead of getting a nice error message, you'll just get like no output. You'll run rake db migrate and there'll be no output whatsoever. And if you were expecting there to be a migration that occurred, no output basically means an error happened. Okay, so now if I go to my console here, if I now type product.new, it doesn't yet know about my new column, but I can type reload exclamation mark, and that will reload my models. And now image file name is part of what it is to be an image, or what it is to be a product. Okay, all well and good. Now I might, if I was doing a more complete system, I might go to my product model and add a validation for these image file names, and I might make it say a validation that was like a format validation, and I would create a regular expression. This is what files look like. We'll leave that for now. What I need to do now, though, is I need to do two things. I need to make it so that from my new or from my edit, I can actually add a file name. And then after that, I need to make it so that these files actually get displayed for the individual products. I'll work on the form first. Remember, I have a form partial, so I only have to make this change in one location in my app views products folder, and I've got this form partial here. It's where I'm sort of, this is the portion of it for a title, for description, the price, stock quantity. I'll just copy and paste these lines here, paste them in down here-ish. There we are. And instead, oh, I see what happened there. Instead of replicating stock quantity twice, I'm going to change stock quantity here to my image file name. And I'll do the same thing here, image file name. And so remember, for both the edit and the new, this form is being built for a product, and each one of these things I'm building is a reference to a property of that product. So stock quantity was a property of the product, price was a property of the product, and we now have this brand new property that we've just added to our database table called image file name. So if we go back to our web view of the store, when we edit, we see an image file name. When we create a new, we see image file name. We can be pretty happy at this point. That seems to have worked. Maybe I will add Coca-Cola to my products. This will be brown sugar water with bubbles. It's $2.34. I have a bunch of Coke, and then I could say like Coca-Cola bottle.jpg. Let's just say I have that image. I don't yet. I'm going to have to put that into my proper folder, but let's just say I want to do that. Create. Scroll down, go to my Coca-Cola. I'm going to edit here. Notice it didn't stick. It didn't stay. And I could try it again, say update, edit it again, doesn't stay. And so there's one step that we need to do, which is we need to go to the controller, remembering that we're sort of scrubbing the parameters that come from the outside world into the Rails application. When we create a new project or a product, or when we update a product, the parameters that we're using comes from this product params, which is itself a private method where we're using the params hash and we're saying which properties are permitted, and we have not yet permitted the image file name. So that's something I tend to forget, like every time I do this, and then I go in and I make the modification. Okay, so now if we go back, we should be able to set our Coca-Cola bottle here. And if we edit it, we see that it's stuck around. And maybe we'll do the same for goat cheese. Say goatcheese.jpg, update. If I edit again, we can see that we've associated this with this goat cheese JPEG. But now I need some images, and because I've done this lecture already once today, I actually have some images already that I can use. And so I'm going to go into my app assets images folder, and I'm just going to copy and paste these two images, the goat cheese JPEG and the Coca-Cola bottle JPEG. So they're there. Now, just being there doesn't mean they're going to show up. Remember in my product partial, I said, well, we need them to show up inside of here somehow. I'd need to get the file name needs to go here inside of like the image SCR. Well, we saw that when we build links, like ahref links with Rails, we use a helper, link to. Same thing goes for images. So instead of hard coding in an image with an SCR and alt, inside of this paragraph tag, I'm going to go into ERB and use an image tag. And now I'm going to go to my product object. and I'm going to pull in the image file name. I don't have to worry about the path whatsoever. Because I'm using image tag, it's going to assume that I'm referencing images that are in my app assets images folder. And so I just need the name of the file, and the name of the file is what we've already saved in this particular property, at least for 2 of our products at this point. So if I go back to here, delicious goat cheese, and a Coca-Cola bottle. Now we have some problems here. Problem number 1 is that if we were to look into the source code, we would see that products that don't have images have empty image tags in them. So that's not the best, right? We're sort of clouding up or polluting our markup with sort of improper empty images. And the other problem is the fact that this image is of a decent size for display, but this Coke bottle it's just sort of way too big. And so again, comes down to the fact that this isn't the best solution for images. If I wanted to change the size of this image, I would now have to go in and maybe open the file up inside of a editing tool and edit it in some way. But we'll look at 2 simple solutions for these 2 problems. The first solution is that we don't want to add this paragraph tag at all if an image isn't present. And so I'm going to wrap this in an if statement and indent it. And what the if statement is going to say is if the product image file name is present. And that's sort of I'll sort of do this so that we can look at it a little nicer. For any property on an active record object, we can always ask if it's present. We can also ask if it's blank, which is the opposite of it being present. So there's a dot blank question mark and there's a dot present question mark. Blank will return true when the property is either null or nil, or if it's an empty string. Present will return true if it's anything other than an empty string or nil. So this should be enough to get rid of those empty image SCRs. So if I reload this page and I view source again, you'll see for the goat cheese we have the paragraph, but for the cow cheese it just goes directly to the description. That's good. As for the sort of the size of the image, I can cheat here, but it's going to be a pretty poor cheat, but I'll show it to you anyways. I can look up image tag inside of my Rails API, and I can see that I can also add things like height and width to my images. So I could specify image tag, and then as another one of my properties I could say, well, the width should be, you know, this number in pixels, or the height. So maybe I want to restrict my images so that they all have sort of a set height, maybe like 100 pixels or 200 pixels. So I'll go in and say image tag, and I'll add a comma here, and I'll say height 200. It's a string because it's going into HTML, and everything in HTML is a string. Smaller Coke bottle, slightly smaller goat cheese. That's all well and good. It's a bad solution. Why? Why is this a bad way of dealing with scaling my images?
Because normally you want to do it through CSS.
It can get distorted pretty easily. CSS would have the same sort of problem. Imagine if one of these images was really big, like, you know, 1,000 pixels by another 1,000 pixels. We're displaying it as if it's small, but our users are still having to download like the full image size. And especially if they're mobile users on like a 3G connection and all of our images are like a meg each, it's going to make for a really slow process. So you never really want to do this idea of scaling in the browser and just leaving the images. If all of your images are maybe off by, a few pixels or a couple, like they're off by 50 pixels or whatever, yeah, you can sort of normalize them by applying a height or a width. But you really don't want to rely on it because you could potentially be sending out a lot more data than you need. This is the big win, again, of using a plugin like Paperclip, which when you upload images by way of Paperclip, it will automatically resize those images for you to whatever size that you've specified in your model. You can ask it for a thumbnail size, a medium size, a large size, and then you could have those thumbnail images be displayed on the home page and maybe the medium size images be displayed on the show page. Okay, that's really all I wanted to show you about sort of images specifically. When we have images that are sort of this hard-coded variety, we put them into the app asset images folder. We needed to add a new property to our product so that we could associate a product with a particular image file name. And then as long as that image file name was present, we used the image tag helper to actually create that tag. The only other thing I didn't talk about the image tag helper was that it does properly add an alt attribute, and what it does is it takes your snake-cased based file name and it just capitalizes the first letter and turns the underscores into spaces, and that's what the alt tag becomes. Any questions on that, sort of that style of adding images to a database table and then to an actual display? Okay, so as you're working on your projects, you might find that you want to add other columns to particular database tables. You go through that same process. You wouldn't probably have to do all of it because they're probably not going to be images themselves, but you will have to go through the migration process. The other thing I wanted to show you were the other aspects of the assets pipeline. And before I do that, I'm just going to make sure I can commit these changes to Git. If I do Git Status, I'm going to see, okay, my changes that I've made to my controller and my partials are there. My new migration file's sort of showing up. Git's also noticing those two image files. But do I really want to save those two image files to my Git repository? Probably not, right? Because they are specific to a particular install of this source code base. They're not going to be common to every store that I happen to make on this source code base. So what I can do is in my root of my project, where the .git folder is, there's also a helpful file called .gitignore. And inside of there are sort of specifications for what Git should ignore. And right now Git's set up to ignore my database files. So any file in the DB folder that has a SQLite extension isn't going to be added to my Git repository. I can do the same thing and say that the app assets images folder, I don't want to save any of those images. So by adding that to my gitignore, none of those images are ever going to be stored. We don't always want to do that. Sometimes we do want images that sort of always are used in our application. Maybe we have a particular image that we are using for a button or something like that. But in our case, we can say ignore all these images. So now if I run my git status command again, it shouldn't see these two JPEGs anymore, just the migration. Okay, that's good. And Git's even noticed that its own gitignore file has been modified. Good, so I can add that. I can commit it with a message added a image file name property to the products table and modified the form and product partial appropriately. And I'll push that to GitHub. Nicely done. If we go back to where we were storing those images. It was the app assets images folder. If we step one back, we'll see that there's other things that are considered to be assets. There's JavaScripts and style sheets. And so if we look in the JavaScripts folder, we'll see there's two files in there, one called application.js and one called products.js.coffee. And in the style sheets folder, we'll see that there's an application.css and a products.css.scss. Let's see how these are being added to our project as it stands right now. If I go to my layout file, you can see that this is the sort of the layout that's being used for every view within my project. So every view is going to have this HTML, and then the view is going to be injected where it says yield here. And so in the head, we have this statement, which is an embedded Ruby statement, style sheet link tag, and another one called JavaScript include tag. And if we look at the actual source of this document, we'll see that this one style sheet link tag on line 5 here expands, at least right now, to these two statements. There's one which is bringing in something called assets application.css, then another one bringing in assets/products.css. For the JavaScript include tag, it's actually to be expanded out into 5 different scripts: jQuery, jQuery.ujs, turbolinks, products, and application. Right now, the CSS file has a comment in it, but it's empty. This is the application CSS. This product CSS file is empty. jQuery contains jQuery itself, the library. jQuery.ujs contains sort of all of Rails's use of the jQuery library. So whenever Rails makes use of jQuery, that's in here. Turbolinks is a new feature that's been added to Rails that I'm not going to get into right now, but it's just an interesting way of trying to speed up a Rails application by intercepting links when they're clicked and forcing it so that the web browser doesn't sort of reload a whole new HTTP GET of the next page. It does it in a bit more of an efficient way. You can do some searching on turbolinks if you're curious as to what this has been or what's happening in Rails these days in terms of what happens when you click a link. These two files, though, are empty. This one has just an empty function in it, and this one has a bunch of comments in it. If again we sort of return to these folders in the assets folder, app, assets. If we look in the style sheets folder, application.css and products.css.scss. Here we have application CSS and products CSS. And so these two files are effectively being mapped to these two files. If we go to the JavaScripts, we'll see an application.js and a products.js.coffee. And here we can see an application.js and a products.js. So what Rails is doing in both of these cases is Rails uses preprocessors for both JavaScript and for CSS. For CSS, the processor is Sass. So this file, products.css.scss, you can put in Sass style rules into there, and before they're sent out to the end user, they're going to be converted into proper CSS, and the browser will be able to interpret that. So they get pre-processed. Same thing goes for JavaScripts. A lot of Rails programmers, instead of writing plain old JavaScript, will actually write a language called CoffeeScript, and then CoffeeScript will be itself compiled to JavaScript, and that's what's going to be sent to the end user inside of this. In our case, the products.js.coffee becomes this products.js file. Let's look briefly at style sheets, and then we'll get into the JavaScripts next. Let's look at these two different files. One is just a plain CSS file. The other one has this Sass extension on it. The plain old CSS file says this is a manifest file that will be compiled into application.css. You're free to add application-wide styles to this file, and they'll appear at the top of the compiled file, but it's generally better to create a new file per style scope. And then we have these two lines here that look like they're comments, but they're actually things that Rails are going to read and sort of act on. One of them says require self, meaning when you compile up the CSS and process it, require the stuff that's inside of this file itself. And require tree dot is meaning sort of look into the folder in which this file is in and find all other CSS or SCSS files and include them in the sort of output that you're going to send to the end user as well. So notice if we do add CSS here, it will be sort of application wide. So I could do something sort of brutally ugly and obvious to our document. Something like going to the body and setting the background color to red. Brutally ugly but obvious. I can now go back to my store. I can reload this page or this page. It's sort of every page I go to that's been applied to it. But it also mentions that it's generally better to create a new file. And the reason is that all files that we add to this folder, because of this require tree statement, are going to be available to us. And so if I had some code that I wanted to add to all of my website, I could add it in a few places. When I created my products controller, Rails has created this for me, this products.css.scss, which is a place to put styles that have to do with the views associated with the products controller. So I could add it in here. I could put in my body, and I could say background color. This time I'll set it to blue. I've removed it from the other one, the application.css. And again, we can see that it's going to be everywhere. Blue, blue, blue. This isn't really specific to my products. So if I wanted to, I could even create some kind of new file in here, which was called something like common.css.scss. And I could open it up, and I could move this over there. And this time maybe I'll set it to green. Notice I haven't had to tell Rails at all about the fact that I've added this new file. It's still relying on this require tree statement just to automatically pick it up. And so if I go back to my document, the backgrounds are all green now. I'll remove that. Anything we add to this common document is going to appear on every page. Anything we add to this products document is going to appear on any page. We really would just use separate documents for just our own structural purposes. Stuff that has to do with products, we're going to put it in here. Stuff that's common to the entire web page, maybe we put it there. It's more of a sort of an organization thing than anything. For now, I'm going to remove this common one. The other thing is, if we were just adding to this document here, this application one, we could only write plain old CSS. Here in the products document, we could add Sass. So like more advanced CSS that allows for Sass-like things like nesting or variables or mix-ins. And so, for example, in our sort of display of products, now I'll go back to it being sort of plain old page. In our display of products, every product itself is a section that includes an H3. And so if I wanted to target that H3 directly in my Sass file, I could have a section. Here I could put rules for the product sections. And then nested within here, I could target H3s. And this would now be only H3s that exist inside of section tags. And so Here I could say maybe for H3s that exist inside of section tags, well, I'll give them the color of blue. This might not be the best example. I'll change it actually, because right now those are links, so we have to also target a link within the H3. But maybe I could do something like font-ish. So I could say the font family is a sans serif font. And now if I reload here, you can see I've now got a sans serif font for all of my H3s. So if I go home, each one of those H3s has the sans serif font. If I viewed source and I looked at this product CSS file, here is sort of the two files. This is my Sass set of rules. Maybe I'll even make this more complicated. Maybe I'll add pretty ugly background color to my sections. I'll set them to gray. And now when I reload this, you can see this has sort of been compiled to a section property that has a background color of gray. And then my nested H3 is now properly defined in CSS section space H3 font family sans serif. So it's just like the end browser never sees my Sass. It gets pre-processed before it gets sent out to the end user and becomes a regular CSS file. So that's, and then if I reload this again, we'll see there's the sections now have gray, sans serif, H3s. I'm not going to leave any of that in here though. So that's the assets pipeline in terms of CSS. We're creating files in here. Some of them have been created for us when we create controllers or when we scaffold things, and we can make use of them. We can add our own files in here. We can add files of .css or .scss, and if they have an SCSS extension, we can put Sass in them, but we can also put in regular CSS. It's backwards compatible to regular CSS. The JavaScripts are going to work in a similar way. If we look at my application, it also claims to be a manifest file. That means it's going to contain these kind of comments that really aren't comments. And here you can see, if you're wondering why Rails knows to include that jQuery, the jQuery US, and the turbolinks, that's these three directives here. So if I sort of removed those three directives and reloaded my page, then these lines would disappear. I can add code to this file directly as JavaScript code, but it tells me it's not advisable to do so. Or I can add code into here as long as it's CoffeeScript code. CoffeeScript, if I do a quick little search, CoffeeScript is a programming language that resembles JavaScript, but it also sort of more resembles Ruby. And so you'll see things like the semicolons are gone from our statements. It has things like trailing if modifiers. This is actually a function declaration right here. So we're defining a function called square that takes a single argument x. This little stabby lambda thing means that this is a function declaration, and it's going to return x multiplied by x. This is what it gets compiled into. This is the JavaScript that gets generated. So a lot of the Rails community really likes CoffeeScript. I don't tend to use it myself, but there's got to be something to it because a lot of people do like it. One of the reasons that I have stayed away from it is often when I'm sort of hacking on JavaScript, I'll have an error and I'll need to debug that error, maybe with breakpoints in my code or whatnot. But now if you have an error in your CoffeeScript and you're sort of trying to figure it out from the client, well, you're debugging the compiled source. So you're not even debugging your own source code anymore. You're debugging what the CoffeeScript interpreter built for you in terms of JavaScript. So you're one level of indirection away from the code that you actually need to be debugging. And I think there's ways around that, but I'm comfortable enough these days writing JavaScript. I don't need a secondary language that compiles into JavaScript for me. But I do know a lot of people that really like the CoffeeScript language. If you don't want to use CoffeeScript in Rails, it's not a big deal. There was a bit of a brouhaha when it got added to Rails, but it isn't a big deal. If you want to remove CoffeeScript support from your applications, you could go into your gem file and you could remove the CoffeeScript line from your gem file, and then in your app assets JavaScript folder, you could just name all of your files .js, and Rails would just treat them the same way. So if I added in, even when I have the CoffeeScript line in here, I can still add in files that are just .js, and they'll be automatically loaded into my project. If you wanted to see just a single sort of bit of code executing, I could just do, and I'll put an alert statement inside of here. This is in my products.js.coffee file. And if I go back to my store and I reload it, it runs. I don't have any requirements in the project requirements document that have to do with CoffeeScript, and I don't really even have any that have to do with JavaScript. You can write fairly complex Rails applications without ever having to touch JavaScript. Rails does a lot of JavaScript for you, but I don't think that for the scope of this project you necessarily need to do anything using JavaScript. You could make your site look a bit more interesting in certain ways. It could be a bit flashier if you include some sort of jQuery or JavaScript magic, but it's not a requirement for the project. So if you're thinking about adding things that require JavaScript, you maybe want to leave those to the end and focus more on sort of the core Rails stuff. And that's our really quick view of the assets pipeline. One of the reasons why this pipeline exists is when you actually go and deploy your website to the web, all of these files that are right now separate files, when you do a production mode deploy of Rails, it's going to take all of the files and concatenate them into a single file, and then sort of minimize that file and reduce its size as best as possible, so that instead of having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different JavaScript files, each of them making a different HTTP request with a bit of HTTP overhead on each one of those, it'll be a single request that'll go to a file that has them all sort of combined inside. And then Rails will do things like minifying and uglifying your JavaScript, which is like it's like obfuscation. It basically takes all your long variable names and turns them into single character variable names, and it reduces the file sizes of your scripts. And it also will take all of your CSS files, put them into one common file, and it'll minify them as well, removing sort of all white space. And so it's an optimization thing. That's mainly why the application pipeline exists. And I think that's all I want to talk about in today's lecture. I don't think I added much more here. Just nothing. I can give you a quick example here from Git. It says that I've modified these two files. I don't really want any modifications. I tried to erase what was modified. It looks like that maybe a trailing space has been left behind. Sometimes you've been working, with Git, you've added something to a file, and you just want to revert that file to the sort of the last known check-in. An easy way of doing it is just to do a checkout on the name of the file. So I can just do a checkout on my app assets. I'm in the right folder, yeah. Java scripts products.js.coffee. But you don't like that path? Oh, what? Why? So that I didn't forget the E. Yeah, there it is. And now if I run status, it's gone from my list. It's basically just reverted that file back to its last commit, the last known commit. And I could do the same for the other one. Git checkout app assets style sheets application.css, and now running git status. I'm clear. And now I will stop the screencasting software.